Oh, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here. It's nice to see everybody at this great offshore wind summit in beautiful Sacramento. So I'm excited about this panel. I know many of you, and if you know me, you know I get excited about talking about transmission, and the intersection of transmission and offshore wind is particularly exciting. So we have today an exceptional group of folks to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities around transmission for offshore wind in California. And we're going to dive right in. So I'm going to introduce the panel very briefly, and as we get into the questions, I'm going to ask them to just give a couple points on your background. So I'm Theodore Paradise. I'm a partner at the law firm of KNL Gates, and I've worked with a floating offshore wind developer based in Europe. I've worked with in-house with a transmission developer. I was 15 years at an RTO, and way back in the day, I worked with California ISO back when NREL was a thing. So it's been a long road, but a lot of interesting lessons learned over that time. Joining me today, we have Travis Duville to my left. He is the Wind Systems Integration Portfolio Manager at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. And next to Travis is Arne Jacobson, Director of the Schatz Energy Research Center at Cal Poly Humboldt University. And then next to Arne is Jeff Billington, Director, Transmission Infrastructure Planning at California ISO. So let's set the stage a little bit for the discussion that we're going to have. There's been a lot of discussion around transmission on the last panel and throughout this program over the last day and a half. And the reason is it is the great enabler of power systems, and it can also be the great bottleneck to moving forward with what you want to do on a power system, or even just reliability or consumer costs containment. So it's a big issue, and for the longest time, it was not the thing that people talked about. Even when we first started doing offshore wind on the East Coast, we focused a lot about the lease areas and getting the wind farms built, and we'll just throw a wire to shore, right, and that'll be fine and it'll work. And it turns out to be much more complicated than that. There's limited headroom, there's limited points of interconnection. So we come to where we are today and some of the lessons learned from Europe, which we'll talk a little bit about in the East Coast. And we see that California has great offshore wind goals, 3 to 5 gigawatts by 2030, and the 25 gigawatt target, 100% clean energy goals, et cetera. And we're not just talking about offshore wind. The CPUC frames it as we need 85 gigawatts of new clean resources in addition to what's currently under development by 2035 to stay on track with the larger goals of the state. So we're really talking about transmission build out beyond just what we need to integrate offshore wind. But these things all work together because it is one grid after all. So we're going to dive into that, and I'm going to start with a question, and again ask folks to just introduce themselves as they start to talk through some of these things. As we think about the California grid today and where we need to go, what are the key challenges of the topology? And we might have a map too that we could throw up every now and again that shows sort of some of the big picture issues, and if we do, that's great, and if we don't, we can talk around it. But what are some of the key challenges of the topology of the grid today, and what appear to be some of the near-term steps that need to be taken to address those and provide some certainty for these first lease areas? So, Travis, let's start with you.
Sure, thank you, Theodore. And yeah, my name is Travis Duville, and I lead wind energy grid integration work for Pacific Northwest National Laboratories, which is one of 17 national labs in the Department of Energy complex. And with regards to offshore wind, I'm a principal investigator on the West Coast Offshore Wind Transmission Study, which is currently underway. We announced that at this forum last year, kicking that off. So we're 1 year in now, and have led some other offshore wind projects. And I should mention that the West Coast Offshore Wind Study is a multi-lab study. And sponsored by the Grid Deployment Office. So it's both PNNL and NREL running that study, and we've made tremendous progress in 1 year. And back to the question that was asked, I think anyone who looks at a transmission map of the West Coast, just seeing what lines exist on the system today, and then also holds up next to that map, and these are the maps we were going to have on the screen, but if anyone's seen the mean wind speed contours, it's a pretty obvious problem. There is zero transmission right where the wind speeds are fantastic. And so that's the fundamental crux, and that's why there's so much work in this area by all three of our entities, and I think we have a story today about how we're complementing each other. A lot of my studies look further out, and we focus on electrical system value. In the past, the studies that we've put out this year, for example, have really focused on that electrical system value and the various benefits that can be accrued through intentional transmission design. But many of those things are pretty far out there. And then I'll let Arnie talk about his work. But it's great to have CAISO on here as well, who thinks that way, but then has to also consider the very next move. So I'll pass it off.
All right, Arnie, same question for you.
Sure. So my name's Arnie Jacobson. I'm director of the Schatz Energy Research Center at Cal Poly Humboldt. The Schatz Center is a group of about 50 people, a mix of faculty, professional staff, and students. We've been working on offshore wind-related topics since about 2018, and transmission and grid interconnection has been one of the areas that we've been really engaged in. I guess stepping even a step back from offshore wind, we spent a lot of time thinking about what does it take to transform our energy system. And offshore wind and integrating renewables is obviously about working to decarbonize the energy system. We think that we need to think about two additional things as we're doing that at a big picture. So decarbonization for sure. In addition, we need to be thinking about how do we make the system more resilient to all the things that climate change is throwing at us as it proceeds. And then third, we need to figure out how do we do all of that in a way that is more inclusive and equitable than the energy system has historically been. And so when we think about these things, we think about all three of those things together. And so I think building on what Travis was talking about, as we're thinking about transmission, obviously there's this issue of, for offshore wind, where the generation is doesn't match up how the transmission system is set up. And so you need to figure out how do you move significant amounts of power from where wind can be generated to where there's significant load. But in the process of doing that, we also need to think about the communities who are in the regions where offshore wind is being developed. They don't necessarily have a significant amount of load, but they do have significant reliability concerns and other grid services and energy system services that need to be addressed and concerned. And so as we think about transmission, we need to be thinking not only how do we move significant amounts of power, but also how do we shore up those systems at the same time. And I want to say that the proposal that the California ISO released for the Humboldt wind energy area, I think touches on all three of those things. So we're pretty pleased with how that came out. It addresses the delivery of power issue, I think, in a reasonable way, but also does things that help shore up the local system in ways that I think are both helping to address resilience and helping to address some equity issues. So really appreciative of how that came out.
No, that's as good a handoff to Jeff as you're going to get, Jeff, with some nice
I'm wondering
words
whether
about
I need
the
to
work
actually
there.
say anything, or whether Andy's already covered a lot. In regards to myself, in terms of I'm an electrical engineer. I've been working in the electric utility industry for over 35 years now, and I've been with California ISO since 2011. And prior to that was in Canada working for the Alberta Electric System Operator and utilities in the areas of operations, maintenance, construction, and planning. So as we look at the transmission, and your question in terms of over the next couple of years, and as we're looking at it, is one of the big things is the with the portfolios and the change and the volumes of resources on an annual basis that are going to be needed to come on, and being able to accommodate those, as well as the longer term resources as we're looking at them. And the offshore wind being being one of those. And we started looking at and working with the CPUC, as Luam indicated, with the portfolios that we receive, sensitivity analysis starting in 2021, 2022 transmission planning on sensitivities, and then in the Morro Bay area, them becoming part of the base portfolio. And in this year's transmission plan, the Humboldt area becoming part of our base. And one of the things, just to give context, is resources that are within the base triggers when we find needs that we move forward on that transmission and then seek approval from our board for that transmission and then proceeding with the development of it. And so in the Humboldt area, as Arnie was indicating, the plans that we've come up in that area, we put in our draft transmission plan after stakeholder consultation through the process. And the plan actually is the revised plan that'll be going to our board next Thursday for approval, posted on our website, highlights in terms of the transmission that we're looking for or seeking recommendation for offshore wind integration in the Humboldt area. And we can get into discussions as we go through on a little bit more detail of that.
No, that's great. Thanks to all of you for that overview of some of those key challenges. So I like to boil things down because I am keenly aware that why I and this group live in a transmission world all the time. Some of you don't. That's probably healthy. And so, to sort of, I think, recap sort of the key things that you all were talking about, it's a mismatch of where you have a resource and where you have the people, the load, that's going to use that resource. Like Travis, you talked about, the wind profiles, and that really matches up with then the lease areas in the north. So, and you might wonder, maybe this is super apparent, how do you get that? Why are we in that? Why are we talking about this so much at this conference? Why have we planned ourselves to that point? And the simple answer was, for the longest time, when we did system planning, right, you looked where there was load, and that's where you put wires, and that's where you put generators. And so if you look at Northern California versus Southern California, you'll see a big difference in load, and therefore a big difference in wires. So I think the upshot of kind of, as you've identified key challenges, is not really a lot of transmission where you need it to get power to load. So how are we going to do that? And as we think about that key challenge, where are we in addressing that? And be candid. I think that helps in a discussion like this. How do you think we're doing? How do we all, I think, have a sense of the timelines of transmission. So where are we in addressing it? Jeff mentioned the California ISO plan, the $6 billion plan for something of which is really targeted to offshore wind. Are we off to a good start? Are we a little late? Are we, what's your assessment of where we are?
Well, I think some of it goes back to, and this goes back to Luam, is back in the December memorandum of understanding with the CEC, the CPUC, and ourselves, really was to do a number of things, but one was to really look at trying to tighten the linkages between the resource planning, the transmission planning, the interconnection and procurement, so that we're really planning the resources in areas that then we're planning the transmission, that then they're going to be interconnected in those areas and procured. And so I think we're moving forward well as we go forward with that. And if you look at our last transmission plans with regards to that, with the increasing portfolios, we've gone from where we were around $650 million per in each on average over the last 10 years per transmission plan, to where we had a $3 billion transmission plan, to the 7.1 or 8.1 when you add the SWIP North for the out-of-state entitlements, to this year with the 6.1 billion, which is primarily, when you look at it, other than there's about 1.5 billion for load growth, for reliability-driven projects, but the 4.5 billion is effectively for the offshore wind, and that's in this year's, and to address and to accommodate into the North Coast area the transmission that's needed to start based upon the portfolios that we have, and there's been lots of discussion around how much and where, but based upon the portfolios that we have, building the transmission. And we can get into it as we talk about it, but is that's a starting point. It's a foundation for, and we look at, and kind of as Arnie was indicating, the approach that we took is and it's consistent with all of our studies, was not starting with what is the base portfolio for this year. And we do a 20-year outlook. We started that, and we had our first one in May of 2022. We're doing an update of it that we'll be releasing in June of this year. But looking at that, and it had 20 gigawatts. So in the North Coast area, it had about 15 gigawatts of offshore wind. And really starting, what is the transmission that's needed for that 20-year outlook? And the 20-year requirements, we also had a sensitivity that the CPUC provided for us that had an 8 gigawatt in the North Coast area, and then the 1.6 gigawatt that's in the base portfolio for this year. And so when we came up with the alternative that we looked at, one was costs, and two was flexibility. And flexibility with the uncertainty of where is the next call area you're going to develop, where is the next, and how much in those, was what flexibility so that it can adapt into various futures. And that was a key component of it, as well as Arnie indicated, the resiliency for the Humboldt area as we're building the bulk system out into that area, the resilience into the area with a connection to the local area. So that's kind of, to me, where we are right now.
Okay. Arnie, your take?
And I think it's worth, stepping back on your question, sort of why is there this mismatch and where the transmission system is set up is, the transmission system was set up for the traditional fossil-based system, and the location of those power plants
Right.
is different from where the renewable resources are. And so part of why there's such an enormous job ahead on the transmission front is just the geographic mismatch between the old resources that we used to use and how you would site those, and the new renewable resources, whether it's solar or land-based wind or offshore wind or others. There's just a big geographic difference. And so that's something that has to be addressed through transmission and transmission planning. And the other reason that that's such an enormous issue is that California's decarbonization strategy is an electrification-based strategy. And so we're working to shift a good deal of transportation to be electric, a good deal of space heating and other natural gas use to being electrified. And so we need maybe 3 times as much electricity as we use now. And so you've got many more renewables that you have to build out, and they're not in the same places as the old fossil fuel plants. So I think it's just useful to step back and understand the enormity of the challenge. And so I think even if you're doing well, the enormity is still there and still has to be addressed, while at the same time having lots of small communities that have their own reliability issues in the mix of that, because we have a transmission system that is old, right, and was built out more than half a century ago in many communities. And so there's a real need to figure out how do we address both of those problems together, and there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Travis?
The other thing I'll add to that is there's this enormous challenge, and we have to kind of thread the needle between meeting that challenge and taking concrete steps that do not close the door on things we might want to do in the future. And that's why I think I'm also expressing a vote of confidence for this TPP and this image here, figure 3.5-3. If folks want to pull that TPP up from CAISO later, I really would recommend it, because I do think this is innovative thinking, and it's a tangible step that the CAISO is recommending. I think that it goes for board approval maybe next week. Is that right?
On Thursday next week.
Thursday, okay. But it seems like a really well thought out step that preserves optionality. And that's significant, because in every context where we've followed offshore wind development, we've heard the warning to not just develop radial interconnections. If you look at the UK, they'll say that really constrains what we can do with all of this energy. There's only so much we can do with just radial interconnections. A lot of the work that DOE has done on the Atlantic seaboard with the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Action Plan has been trying to identify ways, and the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Study, also by the Department of Energy that just was released a few weeks back, identifies alternatives to these radial interconnections for a more beneficial future from this, harnessing the benefits of this resource. And so something like this, there's something you have to read into the page here, but there's some optionality here that's built into this design, in particular the line into Collinsville. It's just, I won't try to describe it all, but there still needs to be work done on how things will be built out into the ocean and brought to shore. But this allows you to do different things as you grow into this, as you lean into this resource into the future. And it enables the onshore system to be able to capture more and more of this offshore wind over time without limiting to just simple radial interconnections to substations at the coast, for example.
Sure. So we have this map up, and I love a map, so I think it's helpful, and there's something for everybody here. So it's sort of the beginner map in the middle, which is the big picture, and that goes to what we were talking about at the beginning. You see the major lines kind of not close to the water up north. Those come down through the middle of the state, and there's already a lot of power on those lines, so it's not like they're coming through the middle of the state and have all sorts of room left. But you'll see the general big picture high voltage layout of California on that big picture map. The inset there on the multi-terminal HVDC possibilities, we'll talk about that a little bit. But this is from a study that Pacific Northwest National Labs put out in September. So now we're kind of getting into the more advanced version of talking about transmission of, Travis mentioned radials. And so keeping to my commitment to try to make sure everyone comes along in this discussion, a radial, think of it as an extension cord out to every wind farm. Okay, and so if you're going to do lots of wind farm, that's lots of extension cords. And what you see there in the multi-terminal HVDC is that Travis brought us a power strip. And so we're going to use the power strip in a few places, and we're going to plug in, and it's even better because we can move power between different platforms. But we're essentially, in that sort of scenario, trying to move away from an extension cord out to every wind farm to some sort of bigger transmission system that can be shared. And if you think about the transmission system on shore, that's kind of how we envision that. There's not just single lines going everywhere, it's all networked together. And then Travis mentioned the other inset there, which is one of the solution examples from the California ISO plan. So we thought we'd put that up there to kind of illustrate some of the work that's being done. So we can call that up from time to time, but we don't need to keep it up. I think that's just to give people sort of the big picture. So thanks for putting that up. So Travis, we're going to start with a comment that you just made, which was, all the studies out there. And there weren't really many studies out there before 2018, 2019. Yeah. And that's when we started to see studies in the US. Brattle did some early work. Schatz was doing work. DNV with Offgem in the UK. And the upshot of a lot of these studies was if you're going to go and do offshore wind transmission, it's a real opportunity to design a power system from the ground up. And, Arnie, you mentioned reliability benefits. And, can we reduce the number of cables? And so limit the number of landfalls, the number of trenches, so the environmental impact, the costs. Can we network them and move power around? Which, for Jeff and California ISO is exciting because, that's more controllability over power, and I can move power north to south and all sorts of things. So we've seen sort of those studies, but in the US we have not really done a lot of that. There's a program in Texas where they built out a lot of transmission lines into the grasslands of West Texas back at the start of this century and connected a lot of onshore wind. There was a smaller version of that, Tehachapi. The California ISO did build out lines for some wind, but when we think about that sort of bigger planning coming from a mindset of not overbuilding, not gold plating, not building too much, how do we move from that current incremental approach to that bigger picture planning? And and I won't put Jeff on the spot here, but do we think that where we're going with this California ISO plan, is that a good first step? Do we need to do more? Do we have barriers to address? What are your thoughts on how to get to some of the bigger picture benefits?
Well, I think we're moving towards that quite well, actually, right now, and as we're going forward. And that was one of the impetuses for us in 2022, or really started in 2021, the development of the 20-year outlook, and to look at the longer picture, to make sure that what we're planning in the near term fits into that longer term vision. And then I will have to say, and this was with Luam and what we're coordinating, and with the CPUC and the IRP process, we've gone to, and John alluded to earlier in terms of to a zonal approach, and looking at and working with the CPUC as to the portfolios and the increasing of the portfolios that really have got us onto the trajectory of what we're planning for now to meet those goals in 2045. But that zonal approach of where are the resources, and the CPUC mapping out kind of where the resources, taking into consideration a lot of factors in their methodology for that where the resources that we should be planning the transmission to. And that's kind of reflected as we move forward with the significant development in last year's transmission plan, with the offshore wind included in this year's, moving the transmission. As we look at the 20-year outlook next year. And then one of the other things as well is in the load forecast and in our annual transmission planning process, the load forecast and the resource portfolios needing to go, and I think it was SB 887 identified that the CPUC and CEC are provide us forecasts that don't go just 10, but go 15 years out. And so I think we're moving in that direction of getting the transmission and meeting and the requirements. The next will be, as we move forward, getting the implementation of those to go forward. And the other is in our interconnection process, going through interconnection process enhancements that we're also bringing to our board next week, so as to get the resources that are in the queue that are ready to move forward, able to move forward and interconnect to the system.
Okay. And Arnie, thoughts on what Jeff just said, and some of the work that Schatz has done has talked about some of this coordinated benefit too. Is everything great, or can we do some things better? Are there missing pieces in authorities or coordination? What's your take there?
So I think there's a couple of things to add to that. We also, some of the studies we have done recently are also looking a fair bit out into the future and trying to understand how things might be staged. And I think one of the things that becomes very evident once you start to look a few decades out in terms of what the transmission system might look like is that a lot depends on what happens with particular technology development. Mm-hmm. So for example, being able to do undersea high voltage DC transmission will require some advances around availability of floating HVDC conversion stations. It will also involve availability of cables that are able to work at depths that are far beyond what is currently available. Whether or not those things emerge and whether or not there's enough of a global market signal to create demand for those has real implications for how we can plan the transmission system here. And so I think paying attention to the technology issues is a key part of the story. And then going sort of all the way to the other side of the story, one of the enormous challenges with any transmission project is always the routing and siting dimension of things. And when you're going from areas such as the North Coast, which have a lot of ecologically sensitive areas, and a number of other, rugged terrain and a number of other challenges, figuring out the routing and the siting is key. I think one of the real important needs in all of that is figuring out how do we do a much better job of including tribal nations and communities in the planning process. The transmission planning process works well in many ways, but it's a really technical process, and it's the number of stakeholders who are effectively able to engage in that process is limited. There's not an easy way for tribal governments, for example, to engage in those processes. there's not an easy way for many other communities to engage. And that's something that we need to I think, address, because if we're going to need to build a lot of transmission, there's going to need to be the community buy-in that enables that to happen. So I see that as a real, something that we really need to be working on right now, so that we get to a better place in the near term.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I would say that people talk about multiple benefits of transmission and planning transmission through multiple benefit streams. And I feel like that's done today by groups such as Jeff's, and it's done really well. But I do think in terms of tangible next steps, there's more that could be done to acknowledge those types of benefits that Arnie is speaking to today as the next kind of evolution of that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch on one in terms of, and Arnie talks about the siting and permitting. When we do the planning, we look at it from a very high level of what is the needs. The siting and permitting gets, when we, in this case here, will be going through a selection of, subject to our board approval, competitive solicitation for parties to build. They will do the detailed siting and permitting. But I do want to acknowledge as well, and Arnie was a part of, and working with the CEC and the collaboration was, and Aspen, who has a booth out here, developing of a high-level corridor assessment for the Northwest, and that's published on the CEC's page and we're referenced. And those kind of things are vital as we move forward in how we look at things and making sure that we're kind of incorporating those as we're planning.
Yeah, and Arnie, you mentioned some of the benefits, and Travis, you started to touch on it. But one of the things that really struck me about the PNNL work that came out in the fall was how you really, it was about offshore wind, right? But if you read that, it was really a story about the benefits of different transmission configurations. And the upshot of that report, if folks haven't read it, I recommend it. It is a little weedy, but it's very accessible too. Is it matters how you do it. You get different outcomes, even if you're connecting essentially the same amount of wind. And while it's technology dependent, and Arnie make the point about the timelines on some of the floating, can you talk a minute about some of the benefits? Because I think when people hear transmission, they think, okay, wires and cost, but it can actually start saving money and increase reliability and bring industry, and has a whole bunch of things that come with it.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. I would say that from that work, probably the one major finding that I think was new was the demonstration of capacity benefits purely through transmission design. So in other words, intentional design of transmission can improve an adequacy offering that might come along with the development of transmission to harness a new resource. So this goes to the theme of as we harness offshore wind, we have at the same time a compelling opportunity to modernize the grid. And transmission can do other things. It can, improve our resilience posture. Obviously, it can increase our reliability. When we think about, NERC types of reliability requirements, N-1, N-1, requirements. There are production cost savings that are, attainable through transmission design. There's a whole series of things. I mean, there was even like a hedge value in terms of how much, because you're enabling more renewables, more zero marginal cost resources that are less reliant upon fossil fuels. There's a financial hedge value that can be wrapped into transmission planning. So there's a long list of things, but I would put at the top of that list, the former panel, I think it was Adam from CPUC, mentioned the adequacy contribution from offshore wind and how that's a really important part of the story for California. That's true for the Northwest as well. That can be enhanced significantly through intentional transmission design.
No, that's great. Then I want one more question from me, and then move to some of the questions that we've got. And that is a thing that I've heard a lot of discussion about in the last 18 months, especially, more than I've ever heard before. And that's on the use of advanced conductors when we're talking about existing right-of-ways. So here we're going to stop for just a second. We're going to go to class. What's an advanced conductor? So the wires that you see along the road, they're steel and they're wrapped in aluminum. And then just like a electric stove, when you put a lot of electrons and excite, those electrons, it can get hot and it turns red. Well, that happens to transmission lines too, and the amount of heat and how red they get is the limit of how much power you can put through those and how much power you lose putting it through. And so you get sort of a limit to the size of wire and how much power you can put through that particular wire. And if you get it hot enough, it starts to actually get very pliable and it starts to sag, which is not a great feature if you're worried about things like wildfires, because it will just keep going. We had a blackout in the east in 2003, which was sagging into some vegetation, for example. So an advanced conductor has been around for a couple decades, and what those are various iterations of technology, but they'll have a different kind of core, like a carbon core, and they'll wrap things, and you can move more power over the same size wire in a right-of-way. And why people have been excited about this over the last 18 months or so, including FERC, is we have all these right-of-ways, and you mentioned siting is very hard. It's hard to do a new right-of-way. It's not the Wild West anymore. And so can we put new wires essentially into existing right-of-ways, even at the same voltage, and get benefits? And so we've seen that in the interconnection order, and we saw it. There was a big planning order that came out from FERC on Monday that has these types of conductor studies now mandated in it. So start with you, Jeff, on CAISO's thoughts about that. How are you thinking about advanced conductors, and is that going to be a big tool in the toolbox to maybe open up a lot of transfer capability in existing right-of-ways?
I think it's one that as we're going forward will. It's one where the costs are considerably higher right now, but that's one of the things is the more it gets used, the more it'll come down in costs. And the applications, I'll just put it this way, if we're talking about the Humboldt area, that's not an option because there is no wires. In areas where we have existing, we are looking at it in the transmission plan. There's a whole section on that. It's section 8.3 in the revised draft of the transmission plan of projects that we've looked at. We have, and there's about 6 projects of current that we've approved that are moving forward or in service that use advanced conductors. And as we look forward for opportunities, is there places? But you have to look at where is it appropriate, just like anything else. But that's part of the evaluation as we look at it. And there's more, I would say, desire, which hopefully will bring the cost down, which then will lead to more applications.
Sure. And Jeff and Travis, are you thinking about those in your studies? Are you taking new looks at kind of some of these technologies that are, I think, deployed, in various parts around the world, but not as much in the U.S., but seem to have a lot of promise?
We're very excited about advanced conductors and the role that they could potentially play. As Jeff noted, you have to look carefully at the specifics, but I think that they have a big role to play because the siting questions are so challenging. Anything you can do to expand what you're able to do in an existing corridor is a good thing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also, we think about kind of a host of technologies that are on the horizon. I'll just throw out low frequency, high voltage alternating current is another thing that we think about, but that's even less proven and it's further out there. But the promise there is 10x the power through a corridor that exists today on
right,
on
which
AC.
compared to like 2x of like an advanced conductor, that's
right.
a big upswing. Okay, so we have just a little bit of time left, but a few questions, and this is a big one. It comes back to sort of what are the benefits? And we've talked a lot about the benefits of offshore wind and transmission, but the question here is, are there opportunities for local reliability benefits from California ISO proposed transmission upgrades on the North Coast? So is this going to make life better for folks in
Yeah, Arnie touched on that really, and that's one of the, if you have the diagram up, as little as you, basically in the Humboldt substation, is a transformer down to 115 kV, which is in local. So it's integrating in the area, need a phase shifting so to manage the flows. But providing resiliency for the 2 115 kV lines that come out. You have the gas plant. Does that allow for the future retirement of the gas plant? And so that's built into the plan that we're recommending for approval.
Yeah, so I think the short story is that it can bring a lot of benefits to the Humboldt Bay region. There are communities that are essentially on spurs that come out from the Humboldt Bay system that won't receive as much benefit because their reliability issues have to do with what's happening on those spurs. And I think it is important to be looking at how do we provide reliability inclusively across the region. And so there are other strategies that I think we need to be looking at, including microgrids and other things for some of those communities in those circumstances, and that's something that we are involved in, and we think there needs to be more attention and more investment in those areas as well.
Anything to add on that, Travis?
Nope.
No? Okay. So we are about at time here, so I'm just going to ask quick from each of you, what is the critical next step you'd like to see? This can be your Christmas wish list sort of thing. What do you think needs to happen? What do you want to see happen as the next step?
One thing I think for me is approval of the transmission plan by our board next week.
Right.
And then the continuation of it. And like I say, making sure that we're looking at from the long view so as to what we're recommending for approvals are fitting into in an orderly fashion so we can get to where we need to be for the goals for the state going forward.
Barney?
I'll just note something that we're working on now that's a follow-on to some of our prior transmission studies, which is looking at integrating storage. So basically combining offshore wind, storage, and transmission to try and figure out what role can storage play in optimizing the overall system, both from a offshore wind and system cost perspective, but also from a sort of micro-siting reliability question for some of the maybe outlying communities in our region. So we're excited about that study, and we'll be working on that for the next 6 to 9 months.
That's great. A huge storage story here as well. And Travis?
And I think we need to get really good at high voltage direct current transmission in various settings. So one of the recommendations from that Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Action Plan, long read, but some really good stuff in there if you're curious, is calling for an HVDC Center of Excellence, a national Center of Excellence. That's something the UK has. Other countries have done similar things. I think we need to get move beyond the HVD installations that we have already put in place to date and have been very successful. There are at least 3 I can think of off the top of my head, and move really towards multi-terminal DC, which requires interoperability. I mean, I think really the kind of the ocean side of the image that you saw from CAISO is going to call for, in multiple studies that people here on the stage have run, multi-terminal DC topologies, and it's a bit unproven at this point. I'll say that, Theodore. So
All right.
we need to lean into it.
That's great, and it's where Europe is going very quickly. So thank you for this excellent discussion. I've really enjoyed hearing from you and talking through these issues. Please join me in thanking this great panel today.